Akanksha, we are live.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Anekdhara's 54th edition. Today, we're going to be discussing Gen Z and the idea of politics, hopes, and anxieties. I'm Akanksha Pandey, and I'll be your moderator today. We have two fantastic speakers with us, but before that, I'd love to do some context setting. Young people in India are coming of age at a moment of layered simultaneous disruption, a shrinking job market, AI transforming the nature of work faster than institutions can respond, a public discourse that has become increasingly polarized, and underneath all of it, the quiet but persistent weight of climate anxiety. And yet, the same generation is more connected, more educated, and more vocal than any before. They're not disengaged, but how they engage and what they expect from politics and democracy is the question we're here to explore today. What does Gen Z's relationship with politics tell us about the future of India's democracy? That's what we want to unpack with two, like I said, fantastic speakers. It is my privilege to introduce our first speaker, who brings in exactly the kind of lensing that this conversation needs. Dr. Vidya Ved is an associate professor of sociology at Jawaharlal Nehru University. She did her MSc and DPhil from Oxford and has held postdoctoral positions at the Department of Sociology at Yale and at the Center of Study for Developing Societies in Delhi. What I find particularly compelling about her work is where it sits. It's at the intersection of social mobility, inequality, education, labor markets, and gender disadvantage. These aren't just abstract themes, they are the lived texture of what Gen Z is navigating right now. She's published in the Annual Review of Sociology, the Economic and Political Weekly, Contemporary South Asia, Studies in Indian Politics, among many others. Her book, Uneven Odds, Social Mobility in Contemporary India, published by Oxford University Press in 2018, is an essential reading for anyone trying to understand aspiration and inequality in India today. She has also co-edited a volume of Marginalities and Mobilities Among India's Muslims, and most recently, Youth Futures and Precarious Urbanism, published by Routledge just this year in 2026. It almost feels like the last one was written for this conversation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vidya Ved. Professor Ved, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and for having me as a part of this webinar. Perhaps every era has had a conversation around its youth, possibilities, potential limitations. In the recent discussions of the so-called youth bulge or democratic dividend, it is clear that with the possibility of a larger workforce come the anxieties of the lack of employment and sustainability. What sets Gen Z apart, perhaps, is the pace of transformation, as was just being mentioned in the introduction, among which they are growing up, as well as the more heightened sense of uncertainty. There is a certain value given to youth, where youth has been seen as a sort of resource in itself, in the public discourse, as well as involving the state. However, conversely, a disengagement of the youth from the labor market, or as has been termed the time pass youth by Jeffrey and colleagues, is in turn where these anxieties and aspirations can be seen as closely related to their engagement in political activities, both during and outside the period of elections. What underlines a lot of more recent conversation around the youth, especially, is social transformation, hope, potential, and change alongside forms of politics that appear to challenge mainstream institutions. With current discourses on the youth in the region, from Nepal to Bangladesh, and more recently in India, there is an undercurrent of uncertainty where the promise of aspirations and that of the youth as concrete, socioeconomic, and even as affective categories has changed. In this regard, and since the remit of today's discussion, this webinar is quite broad, I'll be focusing on one component with larger ramifications for political engagement and disengagement. That is aspirations and anxieties, especially for young women, which is among which I've done my work, as tied to education and the labor market. I will relate this discussion to anxieties among the youth and to relation to their political lives at the end of the talk. Educational expansion without clear job outcomes can lead to a sense of disenchantment with education itself. So while credentializing and certification remain crucial in competing for the jobs that are on offer, and the expansion of the private educational sector, I think, is testimony to this, the actual engagement in acquiring the education or the value of education in itself can begin to lose its promise. Some figures from youth reports over the past 2 decades, as conducted by Lokniti CSDS, give us an overall picture of youth engagement and anxieties. When we look at the broader engagement in politics, we find a complex picture with periods in which interest in politics increased. So one period that they found was around the anti-corruption movement, the Anna Hazare-led movement, with other periods of plateauing of interest. Lokniti has also interestingly found that interest in politics varies by education, with more educated youth showing more interest. Now, the anxieties and worries of the youth are clear through these surveys consistently. Unemployment is listed as the biggest problem that faces the youth. And in the context of uncertainty, interestingly, the youth are more likely to state that they would prefer a government job with a lower salary or any permanent job with a lower salary versus a more uncertain job but with a good salary. And in this, government jobs are especially valued. This is interesting to think about since it contrasts with larger drives to privatization and entrepreneurship that has otherwise accompanied liberal economic reforms in India. Thus, actual data suggests that youth aspirations are different from perhaps what has been imagined. While we have a better understanding of the anxieties and aspirations among young men, we do not have such a nuanced understanding among women, especially how they negotiate aspirations in their everyday. I will focus specifically on aspirations in the labor market as they're expected to play a role in upward social mobility. Social mobility is relevant since the desire for upward mobility is often what drives people to aspire in the first place, as does the fear of downward mobility, which can either be a motivator for hard work or for a disenchantment with work itself, and in turn with broader social political engagements. In my macro, which is my all India research on patterns of mobility, I found that urban women in particular are unique in that they display not only more social mobility than urban men, but that this mobility is also more in the downward direction. We hence see that there's a possibility not only of more opportunities for urban women, but also greater precariousness. Also, these patterns are very distinct for younger cohorts of women. In this context, then, the question arises about how women, especially young women in urban settings, view opportunities of work and mobility, and in turn, how they negotiate their work aspirations, and more crucially, and I'm interested in looking at potential disappointments. What do they do when aspirations are not met or remain unmet? Also, women experience work and barriers and opportunities differently, and this varies by the nature of work. For instance, research has shown that women in business face a unique set of challenges when it comes to accessing finance, the gender expectations from their role, childcare responsibilities, and so on. And this might be exacerbated more for younger women who are just entering the labor market. Furthermore, participation in the workforce has neither kept pace with participation in education nor with values that inform aspirations for upward social mobility. For instance, we find in Geert Denev's very interesting work on Tirupur that women are withdrawn from the labor force to become homemakers, which was seen as necessary for their families to claim middle classness. Now, this challenges a sort of linear theory of modernization, which expects that increase in education would lead to an increase in participation in the labor force and hence increased social mobility and leads to interesting questions about what is happening over here. For the next part of the talk, I draw briefly on a series of interviews that I conducted with young working women in both formal and informal sector jobs in Delhi, beginning in 2015 up to 2023. So there are some case studies. This would place these women somewhere between Gen Y, which are the millennials, and Gen Z. The question, which was said to me in one of my interviews, was, if not work, then what? And it was posed rhetorically by Pooja, who was a former aspiring entrepreneur who was working as a management executive in 2023. This question, despite its brevity, opens a wide range on discussion on aspirations and ambition, posing different implications for differently located people. The question, if not work, then what? For some, it may speak to a matter of survival with some notion of dignity, while for others, for whom survival is not the primary worry, it speaks to a desire for seeking a life that offers more in material and immaterial terms. What is interesting about my interviews is that despite the variation in their responses and backgrounds, there are certain commonalities across the young women. Education, knowledge, and skill sets are seen as essential in life for survival when it comes to those in the lower socioeconomic strata, while further aspirations and ambitions are significant for those higher up the socioeconomic scale or who have already met their requirement of survival. For one interviewee, Shanti, who works as a custodial staff in a public sector institution, given the difficulty she faced in her life, the sense of being able to survive with dignity is what matters. Two other interviewees, the owner of a beauty parlor, Janvi, and a seamstress, Fatima, who work in occupations that require skill, spoke of the importance of education and knowledge that play a role in improving life chances. For the former, her limited education meant that she lacked skills in communicating in English, which she saw as a drawback in interacting with her clients in the parlor. While for the latter, education was seen, and this is important, as beyond credentials. She saw education as jankari or knowledge, which was important for being able to participate in the world with some autonomy, such as in processing paperwork at banks or navigating cities' public transport. What was common across these interviews was a sense of regret in not being able to complete or acquire at least some basic education, which would have enabled some independence and autonomy and the possibility of an improved self. Um, this self-improvement is something these women actively work towards. Janvi is ambitious for her business and spends her free time learning English through watching television and observing her clients to acquire these skills. Among some of the other interviewees who had higher levels of education, the desire for a government job, and this is what parallels the Lokniti studies, was very strongly observed. However, the respondents I spoke to had aimed for civil services, were unable to clear them, and when this ambition was thwarted, they used the higher education they had as an avenue to enter other professions, such as teaching. A fallback option then became important for these women, and disappointment altered their aspirations. From interviews with women who work in clerical positions to banking and teaching, the support for one's aspiration appears to be shaped by families, that the support they receive is from parents who are less educated than them or in lower status jobs or positions is interesting and suggests the desire for intergenerational mobility and the very significant importance of familial strategies in ensuring that social status is not lost but gained over time. However, to understand familial support, we need to understand the differences by gender. The support that these women receive is often different from which male members of their families receive. This comes out strongly in Vishali's case, who's an administrator in a public sector institution, when she discussed how her brother is encouraged to enter the family business, whereas for her, the possibility is closed, even if she is generally encouraged to work. This is difficult for her since she originally aspired to become an entrepreneur in her own right. However, this closure of the avenue of inheritance of a family business led to an interesting outcome for her, where her mother pushed her to study more than she pushed her brother. Education was seen as important in her mother's opinion for Vishali to achieve what she could through work or through marriage, which she couldn't through inheritance. There is a sense of awareness of limits also among these women of what they can aspire to. Hence, aspirations are constrained. And I'll come to this constraining towards the end. While families may support and encourage women to acquire an education, family responsibilities, social obligations, and what extended kin may or may not approve of are reported as limits to these aspirations. In this final kind of discussion of the data, before I move on to a final conversation, I'm going to draw on one interview with a self-employed entrepreneur working in the food processing industry. Pooja, who in 2015, which is the period immediately following our first set of interviews, called it the toughest time in her life. Her business folded up when she wasn't able to retain funding for it. The anxiety of such an event can take a toll on anyone, and especially on a young woman seen to be working in a male-dominated field. While she has requisite support at home to tide over the tough period, there was an anxiety over failing business and what the future would hold. This pressure might lead some to give up, even harder. Pooja felt what she called a desperation to prove herself, which she did by working with an acquaintance and then in a more established firm. 8 years later, in our follow-up interviews, while ruminating on the experience of thwarted ambition with a failing business to her name and the absence of what she felt was requisite education and skills, was something she strongly underlined. And I'm going to quote her when she says, "I thought if you were an entrepreneur, it would not be that difficult to find another job. Everybody across the board wanted an MBA or they wanted an XYZ qualification. I don't have that. What I do have is 6 years of intense experience, but I don't have the stamp of approval that is so desperately needed," unquote. Hence, knowing the right kind of people, having the right kind of education was crucial. And here it is credential, which indicates skill acquisition rather than the years of work experience, which one expects would have mattered more. A fear of downward mobility hence is real, especially for someone who has experienced this decline and failure once already, and as she said, she feels the pressure of age. This seems to have led her to become more risk averse with age and experience. Now, this case is interesting to study the importance of being ambitious, facing failure straight on, working hard, using dissatisfaction as a motivator, and being able to open to changing one's aspirations and ambitions in light of everyday experiences. In all of this, being young matters. The risks Pooja was willing to take in her 20s are now too difficult for her to consider in her middle to late 30s. Youth then is a time of possibility, but in this case, only for those who can afford to take the risk since they have other potentially familial support. The question then is, does one risk working towards a goal despite financial hardship or family obligations, especially if the overall system is not conducive to taking that risk? For Vishali, going back to Vishali, who was the administrator I spoke of earlier, working towards a different career, not taking a risk, has had a major impact since she has remained in the same position for a long time. Over the whole decade, she was in the same job. While this position is stable, it otherwise does not pay well and offers no career advancement. However, since her obligations to her family have increased and she's married and has a child, she's willing to not take the risk. I mean, she doesn't want to take the risk because at least this provides security. And this ties in really with the macro data Lokniti is talking about, of where people would prefer a more stable and secure job rather than an unstable job with a higher pay. However, another way of observing this risk aversion is by placing it in the context of social mobility. Most people aspire for upward mobility, failing which stability is a close second. The fear of downward mobility can be a great motivator, and having something stable to rely on was better than what was just out of reach. Interviews with these diverse women show us that while a discussion of aspiration applies to all of them, the differences within women are significant. The more well-to-do think about ambition and plan for the future, while others not so well off are constrained in their aspirations and aspire instead for a better life for them and their children rather than for a more specific career advancement. Aspirations are hence complex rather than a singular concept that contains within it many themes and components which are relevant for today's talk, such as hopes, anxieties, and regrets. Studying this complexity is important given the size of the Indian youth and the opportunities and challenges that lie in their path. For the youth now, more appropriate opportunities in a rapidly changing labor market, as well as a level playing field with parity between education and occupational opportunities are possible pathways to controlling the uncertainty and unpredictability about the future that otherwise threatens to overwhelm them. This will have important ramifications for the desire for political engagement or disengagement in the coming years. To conclude my discussion, and I'll tie this data with the theme now, the panel today addresses youth and politics with an emphasis on hopes and anxieties. There are many ways to think about politics, from electoral engagement to engagement in socioeconomic issues, participation in civil society to expressive social movements. For this talk, I see political engagement among youth as an expression and a response to prior concerns and tensions. Hence, I began this talk by thinking about a space before politics, but which addresses the aspirations of youth and desires and anxieties regarding social mobility in India. I then drew on my own work with young women, showing how these themes play out in their lives and how they understand these processes. What underlines these conversations now is a greater sense of uncertainty regarding the potentials of their lives. Any interest in contemporary youth politics necessitates understanding themes and processes that shapes the life of youth, even if they may not seem political. It is an attention to concerns such as aspirations, whether achieved or thwarted, and experiences of mobility that have always generated anxieties. Politics is an expression and an end result of these processes. In the end, sociologists have correctly treated youth as a liminal, though universal category. The reason why we must take this category seriously is that this is the period of life when pathways to the future are supposed to be set. Tensions, anxieties, frustrations in this phase of life can either lead to malaise or boil over as anger, both of which have important, though different, political outcomes. Thank you. I'll end here.
Thank you, Professor Ved. That was incredibly rich. Specifically, your interviews with young women, I thought, brought a deeply lived perspective on the issues of aspiration, hope, anxieties. Particularly, a couple of ideas that will really stay with me, and I'm sure with the people listening, is shared aspiration to build a meaningful life, not just materially, but in terms of dignity, autonomy, and self-improvement, and how youth as a moment of risk is not just a matter of possibility, but also a matter of constraint, depending on where you're located in the social strata. So this was incredible. I think this is a great segue to introduce our second speaker, who approaches these questions from a different but a deeply complementary angle. Welcome, Professor Srivastava. Professor Sanjay Srivastava is a distinguished research professor in the Department of Anthropology at SOAS University of London. His work as spanning urbanism and urban cultures, consumer cultures, the middle class, masculinities, and the new cultures of work. His key publications include Constructing Post-Colonial India, National Character and the Dune School, Passionate Modernity, Sexuality, Class, and Consumption in India, Entangled Urbanism, Slum, Gated Community, and Shopping Mall in Delhi and Gurgaon, and most recently, Masculinity, Consumerism, and Post-National Indian City, published in 2022. What makes his perspective particularly valuable and complementary to what Professor Ved said is he has spent decades studying how young Indians in cities navigate aspiration, identity, and belonging. Please welcome Professor Sanjay Srivastava. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Akansha, and I'm glad that Divya provided a very specific, locally informed framework, but that allows me then to kind of move to the other level that anthropologists, sociologists also work with in terms of looking at the local but providing a broader picture. So I think this it'll be a complementary presentation by both of us. So of course, one context I want to begin with is the longer history of youth in public spaces, right? And in the Indian context, of course, the immediate long history is the national movement, which is portrayed both in actual life as something that young people became involved with, and also in Hindi cinema, as you know, is full of youth and nationalism. Is very much a young person's movement. So there is a kind of a longer history. And I think what Divya said also allows me to build upon the long history to think about what is different about what is happening now, what's happened, say, during the emergency, which was also very much a youth movement. And then during the India Against Corruption movement, and what is happening now, for example. So hang on, can you hear a noise in the background? Is that okay?
We can't hear, so it's all good.
Oh, that's fine. Okay, I thought there was noise. Okay, so
your signals are weak, sir. So
is it?
Internet signals are weak. So
is it weak?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
No, we can hear you. But
well, there's no disturbance, sir. You could carry on.
Okay, fine, all right. So let me begin with an anecdote, just as Divya did. You know, I was doing some field work at a skills training center in a place called Dausa, which is in Jaipur. So people from quite poor backgrounds, especially Dausa has a large tribal community, okay? So a lot of them being trained by the government in the so-called skills development centers to get jobs in the private sector, often in shopping malls, mall managers and service sector jobs, and McDonald's and KFC and that kind of stuff. And it was specifically meant for jobs in the private sector. But what was interesting, as Divya points out, that at the end of it, and throughout the training, almost everyone who was training, they thought that this would get them a government job. That was what was really key. And so what has happened, of course, is that now we are living in an era of so-called market domination, so-called outsourcing and platform delivery, and lots of jobs in terms of Swiggy and Zomato. And there is this, in social science at least, there's a lot of writing about so-called neoliberalism, right? Where the state has outsourced many of its activities to the private sector. Many people supposedly aspire to getting private sector jobs. And yet what we see concurrently is a deep desire for government jobs, okay? And that also reflects a long-term relationship with the state in India, because the Indian state is a very powerful body, the way it governs. Some of you have worked in the government, you know that the state can do and can give you access to resources and to various other things that the private sector cannot. So I'm going to provide a series of contexts within which we might position this contemporary upsurge. For example, what is happening in Jantar Mantar right now, the contemporary upsurge in youth activism. So one is, of course, while there is an insertion of the market, and the market has become pervasive in many ways in private medical health, private universities, private schools, private infrastructure construction, et cetera, the state continues to be a deep object of desire, and we can come back to that, just as one context. Of course, concurrently, what has also happened is a devaluation of higher education. By which I mean a real devaluation of what university education kind of jobs it can get you. So now you will see lots and lots of people with PhDs from a whole range of universities applying for the lowest rung of a government job, for example. What has also happened is simultaneously as people desire social mobility, there's also been a real devaluation of higher education, what it can get you. So often you'll find, as you drive from Delhi towards Moradabad and beyond, the highway is lined with engineering college, MBA colleges, and most of them, as you well know, will end up with jobs that might give them 10 to 15,000 rupees a month. And large numbers of them, as increasingly a lot of research indicates, in India, we produce large numbers of unemployable graduates. So we produce about 8 million graduates per year. And large numbers of them are largely significantly unemployable in the terms of the aspiration, the kind of jobs that they want. So the kind of social mobility that they want. Simultaneously and concurrently, there's been an attitude towards technical education, whereby technical education has historically always been devalued in India, in the sense that and in the sense that people would much rather prefer non-technical degrees, not technical degrees in ITIs that may make you a good plumber, good electrician, good carpenter, etc. But people prefer non-technical degrees, which they assume will give them direct access to a white-collar job. And of course, this another level is really also linked to the caste system, whereby historically within the caste system, people who worked with their hands, who did kind of technical jobs, were obviously people who do not belong to so-called upper castes. Okay, so there's been, and that attitude has not really shifted in the Indian context. That attitude of white-collar jobs, desire for white-collar jobs, and getting a university education, which does not necessarily allow social mobility. In fact, a lot of university education in India, I think, actively prohibits social mobility, but the kind of degrees that people end up getting at universities of all kinds does not necessarily allow them to get jobs which would in fact provide social mobility. So ITI, technical education, has been deeply devalued. Increasingly, as we see much more recently, I think technical education has also become devalued because of really spurious frameworks that have been introduced into technical education. And I'm referring to much more recent ways in which so-called Indian knowledge systems have sought to be inserted into technical education. So that's the other significant context within which we might think about youth cultures, the contemporary involvement of youth in public activities, public politics, which then leads me to think about, as I think Divya was also just suggesting, the changing notions of politics itself. And I think that is what is also different from what happened, say, in the national movement, what happened during the emergency, though I think it shares much more with what happened, it shares much more with the India Against Corruption movement. That is to say that I think politics is no longer a consistent field of thought. Politics is much more about an instrumental attitude towards what one wants. So I think in many ways, if you think about what's happening in the contemporary movement, the the CJP, for example, many young people who are demanding the removal of a BJP minister because he was seen as responsible for the leak of papers, which again may disadvantage many people. So they may demand the removal of a BJP minister from his political post, but they may not necessarily be against BJP in general. So I think that what has happened much more recently is a shift in the manner in which politics itself might be understood, not as a consistent ideological position, and not in a position that necessarily demands a specific political attitude, which is exactly the same from point A to point Z, but which is very much about a change in the way people think about their aspirations. I think that's a big shift in politics, how we understand politics, and that is a kind of politics. We may or may not be comfortable with that. Certainly some of us from a different generation about how we understand politics. But then we need to think about what happens in a deeply asymmetrical society. What happens in a society where educational standards are so different that you have really very good universities and very bad universities. There's almost nothing in the middle. How do people aspire? How do people imagine their aspirations might be fulfilled? So that's been a big shift as to how people now understand politics. So I think that many people who are involved in the CJP subscribe to a particular kind of politics which may not be familiar to many people who have an earlier different form of politics, what politics means. And then we kind of, if we move on then to the larger context within which this politics, these forms of public activism is happening in terms of younger people. One of the themes that listed in the description for today's discussion is technology. So clearly, technology is changing things. It's changing the nature of jobs. It's changing also, it's introducing a much deeper sense of precarity into how the kind of jobs that people do. So while it is true that that AI, for example, many people want to trade in AI, or new forms of technology because they feel that it is something that will allow them greater social mobility. It is also true that in a deeply unequal society, some people will have access to better forms of technology, and some people will eventually end up, and this is what the great fear, I think they realize, a kind of techno coolies, that they will do the bottom level technological jobs because their access to technology, their access to the best forms of technology, the best forms of AI, which allows them access to the best forms of jobs, is going to be limited by their social background, by their caste background, by their capacity to access the best forms of technology. So that is the other context within which I think ideas of politics is changing, that people are much more interested in thinking about how do I take part in a social movement where I know I exist in a deeply asymmetrical society? And it's all very well for someone who studied at, I don't know, JNU or Delhi University in a good college to talk about a politics of a certain kind, but what's in it for me? What is the politics that I should engage in that allows me the kind of social mobility that might have been denied to me because of the kind of family I come from? And I think a lot of people who are involved in the CJP would well be from the people whose notions of politics are a much more pick and choose kind of politics, which is, again, I say, a different form of politics. And I'm providing a description. This is not necessarily a moral judgment at any right now. The other context I want to think about in terms of contemporary youth cultures, contemporary ideas of public activism, but contemporary ideas of politics, and Gen Z in particular, is that there are changing notions of family. Changing notions of domesticity and intimacy. So increasingly, younger people want to have different notions of intimacy. They might want to choose their partners and they want to set up their own home. So no longer necessarily wanting to live in a larger family setup, that they will buy their own flat, for example, set up their own family unit with their partners. Simultaneously, there is this desire that has come into being, let's say, for the last 2 to 3 decades. They also find themselves unable to fulfill this desire because of increasing market precarity. The job they might aspire to are very precarious. Government jobs they're increasing in lesser fewer numbers of government jobs because the government itself, below a certain level, as many of you know, has outsourced these jobs, right? They become contract positions. So increasingly, as people want different forms of family, that is the nuclear family, that is not necessarily, you don't have to end up living with your parents, they increasingly find themselves in a situation where they're not able to find the resources to be completely independent from the parents and the families. Okay, so this is happening, I think, simultaneously. The desire to be independent, setting up your own family, buying your own flat, and yet the incapacity to economically produce that setup. So how does one negotiate this? How does one negotiate the fact that one's ideas of intimacy and domesticity have changed, but the kinds of environment one finds itself does not necessarily allow the young couple to generate enough economic resources to be completely independent. So this is kind of a social phenomenon, you know, a social context within people are growing up. Precarity, and this is also linked, the idea of the precarity, to the other thing that's happened, that is the growth of a market culture, an increasing desire for goods and commodities, the desire to spend on oneself rather than the larger family. And here also by young women. And the big change that's happened over the last 2 to 3 decades is the manner in which women have become consumers, that is, think of themselves as autonomous beings, spending themselves rather than thinking about sacrificing for the family, sacrificing for the father, sacrificing for the brother, sacrificing for the husband, for example. So there's a desire to be part of consumer culture, which in different ways is also a desire to think of oneself as an autonomous subject, and simultaneously then not the capacity to, again, become a completely independent economic subject. So if you put all these things together, it seems to me that what we have is a series of contradictions in which people are growing up. A series of contradictions that were not there in the same way at an earlier points in our history, where young people were driven by at least political ideologies that presented them to them as much more consistent. So in my parent generation, for example, people who would have been part of a nationalist consciousness, the idea of consuming for oneself was a very weak. In fact, it was thought of a terrible thing. Right? You saved for the nation. That consumption was a bad thing. So people did not necessarily think that one needed to be autonomous economic subject and buy things for oneself. You know, you stayed with your family, you saved for the nation, you invested in LIC savings, you invested in postal bank savings, etc., etc. That has dramatically changed. So the big shift has been from the nationalist subject as a savings subject to the nationalist subject as a consumer citizen. And yet that occurs in an environment where your ideas of what one should be do not match how one produces the subject. How does one become an autonomous consuming subject without the capacity to have enough economic ability to be that kind of person? That's one significant contradiction. And of course, the other significant contradiction is the manner in which the state itself promotes entrepreneurialism. The state itself promotes people. The state itself promotes the idea of being involved with the market. The state itself develop these skills training programs. The state itself suggests that you send people to private universities, to private schools, to private medical health, because state has withdrawn from these activities, and these resources now are relatively poor. You know, when you send your kids to government school or send your family or go to a government hospital. So the state itself promotes the privatization of one's life without necessarily enabling the capacity for people to take part in the market activities. So on the one hand, the state promotes the notion of becoming an independent market consumer citizen, but simultaneously that's occurring in a context of great extraordinary precarity. You know, the skills development program that I was doing some research on, that I published on earlier, were interesting because the trainers who were doing the skills development across a whole range of things like service industry, how to become a mall worker, how to become someone at a checkout, how to do different kind of service industry jobs. The trainers themselves were not people who would ever get a job in these kinds of industries. So it was kind of bizarre kind of a context whereby the state provided these skills development programs, but in a way, but there's absolutely, it did not ever seem to me possible that the trainers who were providing training would in themselves ever get a job in the sector that they were providing training for. So what are the ways in which young people find themselves in a context where they're being led to believe that there are these jobs for them in the private sector, and yet the kind of training they're provided only lead them to greater precarity. And you can see why people's aspirations are continues to be strongly linked to getting a government job. Because we know that in India historically, and young people in particular realize this, we've had this love and hate relationship with the state, that we want to be part of the state, and yet, of course, we're hostile to it because of the kinds of arbitrariness that the state can practice upon us. So what I think increasingly we find ourselves, and this is reflected in the CJP movement, is a series of contradictions about being part of something bigger than ourselves, and yet keeping always in mind that this is really about the individual, which is again dramatically different from what the national movement is about. That being part of something bigger than ourselves was always much more about the nation. Increasingly now, even this in politics on a national level, if you think of CJP as a politics on a national level, it's much more about politics, about the individual, and that is of course dramatically linked to the manner in which we have the making of a very traditional modernity. We have the making of a collective individualism. At the same time, the people seek an individual life for themselves. They realize that they're deeply embedded and cannot but be embedded in a collective life. They must depend on the family. They must depend on caste networks. They must become dependent on kin networks. And you can see this increasingly in what is happening, for example, among young people who live on the edge of new cities. They may own land, for example, which is now being sold to private real estate companies for urban development. So on the edge of this Gurgaon, for example, as you move out to the rural areas, many of the former landowning families, often from, say, Gujar caste or Yadav caste, have sold their lands, right? And they become very much a part of the market. And increasingly, however, they realize that the parents, although the families who sold the land have large amounts of money, but if you talk to their children, what they're really appearing for still are these competitive state level exams, police constable exams, because they realize that whilst the market provides you a certain kind of financial gain, ultimately what continues to be really significant in the Indian context is some link to the state. So there's contradiction between the larger context within which young people exist, the manner in which the market has become so much a part of our lives, and yet at the same time, the state continues to be such a powerful player. I think these are some of the contexts I want to leave you with in order to think about changes in politics, in order to think about the anxieties within which young people, Gen Z, and indeed the generation before that, are a part of, and the differences between how politics was played out at an earlier point in time, whether it was the nationalist movement in 1947 onwards, whether it was the anti-emergency movement led by, say, Jayaprakash Narayan. And I think the most significant, perhaps, connections might be something with the India Against Corruption movement. Although I think there are also some differences from that, because even that India Against Corruption movement was in some ways drawing some of its inspiration from the anti-emergency movement and the national movement. So I'm going to stop here, and hopefully what I have said links up with the micro picture that Divya has provided. And there's no such thing as only a micro picture, right? Divya was also talking about a macro picture. So I leave you with some of these contexts, and I'm happy to be part of a discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Srivastava. This was extremely illuminating. I think particularly what I found very interesting was you locating the youth not just in the now, but in different historical junctures, right? Thinking about the independence movement, emergency, anti-corruption, and then the now, the contemporary expression of Jantar Mantar and what that could mean. Another set of incredible, I think, insights from this was youth as a experience of contradictions. So one part of it is we're experiencing youth as being shaped by market dominance, platform economics, neoliberal shifts. But at the same time, there is a deep-rooted aspiration in government jobs and seeking stability, state-backed stability particularly, right? And what that could mean. I know we have Professor Divya only up until 1 o'clock, so I do want to give her some time to respond to some of the things that you shared, Professor Srivastav. Professor Divya, the floor is yours. You can respond to some of the things that we
Great.
discussed.
No, yeah, thank you. And Akanksha, thank you also for kind of bringing it together. So I found a couple of things that I think and I'm sorry I won't stay for the Q&A. This would have been a very interesting Q&A, but a few things that I draw on what Sanjay is saying. So one of them is this idea of an asymmetrical society. And I feel like this is important to be able to understand the way, the kind of contradictions also that Sanjay is bringing about, which is to understand the varying contexts in which the youth live. So we cannot, there's no one youth, right? So the fact is that there are heterogeneities, and as Sanjay mentions, there are marginalities, and unless we recognize them, and we recognize that there are variations across time and space, and the kinds of experiences that might be there, we won't be able to really get that much of a handle on what's happening, because as Sanjay very rightly says, there is a sort of there is a connection in terms of movements over time, but there's also a difference, and potentially that difference is these kinds of more the contradictions. And I found his discussion, Sanjay, your discussion on precarity as tied to consumption, the market economy, all of this is interesting because these are contradictions people are growing up with. It's a sense that I want to be able to have a voice, but I also know that there is a risk to having a voice. And that risk is me, will I get a job? Will I not get a job? If I say something, if I want to have an education potentially because it gets me a job, but I don't know if that education has a value, and what kind of a value that education has. And all of that varies. And I found it in my own work. Some people, young people, but also older people, are more cushioned from some of these factors of precarity because of other factors, and they're cushioned from possibilities of downward mobility. And then there are others who have to face precarity very much in the face, and it's very difficult decisions that have to be made about survival. And I found that it's a very idealistic way in which to ask people, does education matter? Because of course survival is more crucial, and education matters in very different ways. And without an avenue for what that education relates to, which is an occupation, which is some dignity, which is having a say, having your voice matter. We can keep increasing credentials. It won't lead to that, and hence this need, what you started by talking about is the devaluation of higher education, Sanjay, is something that is genuinely a cause of worry. And I think to understand the political engagement, to understand whether electoral politics are influenced in a certain way, to understand whether social movements happen in a certain way, I think we really need to understand how do people see their own self, their self-worth. Mobility can be seen in different ways, aspirations, and how do they see this devaluing, which puts so much immense pressure, because on one end you find that you need the degrees. You need to show that on paper you have this, but you don't know if that actually has any value when there are so many people with the same degree. And then what sets you apart in that context? So I'll end here and open this for the bigger discussion. So I apologize that I'm not there for the rest of the session, but I'll follow this up online. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Ved. You've set up the Q&A beautifully, right? Because you've highlighted the contradictions between aspiration and anxieties and all of those things you're experiencing. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Great. Okay, Professor Srivastava, we're going to stay with you for the next 30 minutes. What I'm going to do is weave in questions from what we're getting from the YouTube audience. As much as I'd like to ask you 100 questions that I have, I'm going to play the role of a moderator and ask you what the audience is asking. One of the first things that was being asked as you were speaking was the role of Gen Z in the Tamil Nadu Assembly elections, right? We're talking about Jantar Mantar, but there's also electoral politics and the domain of that. Any ideas, any thoughts about that?
It's interesting because, of course, I should have said that the youth demographic is very varied regionally in India, right? That both Tamil Nadu and Kerala have a larger aging population than in North India. Okay. The other thing I think is important to remember is that, at least I think, the South India has had a much stronger tradition of a certain kind of political movement that North India has not. Historically, say anti-caste movements have been very strong in South India as compared to North India. The anti-upper caste movements, for example, right, including Periyar and others, and the echoes of that remain in South India, I think. So I think even I would argue that young people in South India, by which I'm going to mainly refer to sort of the three states, like let's say Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala, and not so much Maharashtra, although it's sort of south or west of the south of India. I think that young people in South India, in some ways, have a different form of politics than in North India. I think they have been historically, also because of anti-caste politics, I think they have been historically much more attuned to a certain kind of politics. So even though they may vote for example, they may unseat a certain party which would have had a strong anti-caste politics in favor of another individual or party who may not have been seen to be as strong anti-caste credentials as the earlier party. I think that I still believe that these same young people in South India would continue to much more strongly believe in anti-caste politics, because I think historically they come from different tradition. Because of both grassroots discussions about politics in South India have been different. I'm not going to generalize and that everyone thinks like that. But if I was to present a general opinion, I would say that South Indian youth politics continues to differ from one in North India. They have very different histories. I don't think the anti-emergency politics in North India has left behind the same trace as anti-caste politics, other forms of pro-justice politics has left behind in South India. So I would argue that the young people who voted in Tamil Nadu politics would think of politics, many of them, not only all of them, but I think many of them would think of politics differently, with other things in mind than I would argue young people in North India. I think it's just different historical trajectories, if I'm making sense at all.
No, you definitely are. I think this also links with what you spoke about in terms of fragmentation of the youth, right? There isn't a homogeneous youth. There's heterogeneity. There are layers depending on where you're located and bunch of other factors.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We also have another question from KVS Rao. They're asking, how could the recent Gen Z movements have happened without political support and funding? And how are political parties responding to social media-based movements? Do they know how to handle them or not? Or what are the movements happening?
Well, the party in power, in fact, I think is extraordinarily successful in terms of social media. Its politics is built around social media. I don't really want to put forward a conspiracy theory, but I think that it could be. For example, others suggested that in general, any public protest in the current environment has been suppressed if it feels like a threat to the people in power. So people have been asking as to how is it that this particular movement has been allowed to unfurl itself in the public space. So I guess there are some questions around that. That is it that this particular movement, in fact, does not pose a threat to existing structures of power? people have also suggested whether this particular movement can serve to undermine the political opposition, the party political opposition that exists. And here, for example, if you think of, although Rahul Gandhi is not young, but he's certainly seen as a young person. I mean, in India, category of youth is very movable. So you can be a youth Congress person till about 55, as long as, so you can be youth in India till quite late in your life. So I guess the other question people are asking whether the current movement, at least in North India, is a movement that has some kind of backing because it allows a deflection of attention from the opposition. And in many ways, as I can only tell from media reports that as I said, because the politics that's being expressed here is much more individualistic politics about, my jobs, my aspirations, which is fine. I mean, as Divya was saying, that's a perfect legitimate aspiration. So it's not a kind of politics that necessarily questions a particular ideological position. So I guess many people have been arguing that because it does not question a particular ideological position, that is it because of that they've been allowed to practice their public presence in a space that otherwise many have been removed from. But I guess I would leave it at that, saying these are the kinds of speculation, but I think legitimate speculations given what's been happening to ideas of protest, ideas of people who, on what happens to people who protest against certain ideologies, where they end up and why the young people who are protesting now have been allowed to protest. So I guess that's one way of answering the question that's just been asked.
Yeah. Being allowed to protest is always an interesting thing to build some theories or conspiracy theories around who gets to do it and not. Madhusa has also asked an interesting question around social media engagement. How can one distinguish the participation of Gen Z in social media political participation from performative activism, hyperpolarization, information overload, right? How can young people distinguish between genuine engagement and what could be online spectacle?
Yeah, in fact, I had a discussion with her, I was saying my sociologist friend, that I think that increasingly over the last couple of decades, we have moved into a form of politics which is performative politics. It's very much about competitive politics. And it's very much about a politics which people find easier to participate in. So, for example, there is change.org, right? And it's not difficult. I can just agree with something by signing up. I don't have to go anywhere. I don't have to put my income at risk. I don't have to put my house at risk. I don't have to worry about any police coming to my house. So increasingly, I think what social media has done is also produce a notion of activism, which is removed from earlier forms of activism. So I don't think it is any longer possible to think of political participation as distinct from the kind of personhood that has been produced, which is a performative personhood, which is a form of a personhood which is interested in competitive radicalism, that you must, before someone else says, I support this position, or as soon as someone else says I support this position, I also need to say it, because social media is very much about one's public presence, and one's public presence is very much about a body that is completely non-physical, in the sense that one's body is not at risk in any way. So I think it's very difficult. That's why it's a much more complicated scenario right now. It is impossible to tell the extent to which people will put their money where their mouth is now. And that is people that would genuinely put themselves at risk, because social media has made it possible for all of us to be public, to be activists, to be political in a way that was dramatically different, I think, from nationalist movement or the anti-emergency movement. And that's why it's an interesting time, and because it's no longer possible to tell, as I think Madhu's saying, as to what is at risk, what is at stake. We don't know what is at stake anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even the CJP, a lot of the risks that they were facing was your social media profile will be taken down, right? So your space of communicating and creating social mobility around this topic will be taken away from you. It's not a physical threat; it's a platform threat. It's your social identity on social media. Yeah, it's a very different experience from what the youth was experiencing in the past. Another quick question, and this is coming from me. Professor Divya, as well as you mentioned, there is a tension and aspiration between wanting autonomy. You particularly located that in domestic aspirations and what family and nuclear family means, right? But there is a limitation of economic ability. How do you think that tension is gendered? So I'm curious about how men experience this versus how women may be experiencing.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. No, I'll go back to my example of these families and the borders of Gurgaon who were selling their land, right? They were quite poor families, and they just start selling their land. It's interesting because for women, although families become wealthy to selling their land, young women realize that despite laws that we have, wealth is always going to be passed down the male line. Okay. So for them, it is really important to get education. Okay. So what is happening in many of these families, the women become increasingly more and more educated, whereas the young men drop out in class 10 because they know that the new wealth that is being generated is going to come to them, the wealth, right? But the young women realize that that's not going to happen, at least not in this generation. So this tension between autonomy and what one wants and the lack of autonomy has very interesting gender dimensions, and Divya also referred to this. And interestingly, of course, what happens is that many of these people who are selling their lands, it makes the older men very powerful, the fathers and the grandfathers. So the younger men become increasingly much more dependent on their fathers and the grandfathers. So they will increasingly agree to marry according to how the fathers say. So earlier in Gurgaon and many other parts, there were these bhaichara villages, right? You would never marry in the next village, right? Because there was at least putative relationship, right? But now what has happened is that has completely broken down because their fathers and grandfathers say that to the sons that you need to marry in a similar class, okay? And that can be in the next bhaichara village. And the young men must listen to that because if they don't listen to that, they become disinherited. So while for women, what's important is that they have to go and get education, but they realize that wealth is never going to come to them. For young men, what has happened is that they know the wealth will come to them, and it will only come to them if they agree to what their fathers and grandfathers do. So their autonomy in some senses has become diminished. They cannot do whatever they want. So the interesting dimensions of caste and gender in all these in the mix, which makes it really complicated in terms of ideas of politics, ideas of publicness, what one wants, and what one can get.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think that particularly is very interesting because the way in which one can think about how the future of family and what that would lead to political identities, right? Like that is also a key dimension of what informs political identity will be shaped by these tensions. It's interesting. Going to shift gears. Dr. Ranjan Duda has an interesting question on will vocational education or the re-emphasis on that help minimize employment anxieties or job satisfaction anxieties? Will or can good technical colleges set standards for industry candidates? And how does that play into the youth aspiration?
Yeah. I know that in India, we are very anti-China, but in this case, we really need to learn from China. So what the Chinese have done, they have something called VET system, vocational education training system. So at the school level, at around class 10, you have a system where you work out who can go to university, who wants to go to university, who will benefit from going to university. I don't think everyone should go to university, right? Especially in such a deeply asymmetrical society in India, where the good universities are really tiny and vast numbers of universities provide university education which actually disempower people. What the Chinese do is that they have an incredibly well-educated technical workforce because they have a system whereby industry at different levels is very interestingly has a relationship with schools, right? So that people who want vocational education go to industry and get their training there. In fact, one reason why I think increasingly the Chinese produce good industrial products is also because they have a very well-trained, well-educated technical workforce, which actually then has genuine possibilities of social and economic mobility. What we need in India is not a completely pointless system of credentialism, where people have with university degrees cannot get good jobs with degrees themselves are worthless. What we need is a good technical education system. What we need is a move away from thinking that working with one's hands, technical jobs are lower category of jobs, which in some ways is related to caste. So we also need to move away from the particular thinking. We really need a genuine rethink about what will lead to better social and economic mobility, and not just what will lead to the completely pointless university degrees, where people with a PhD end up applying for the lowest level government job, right? We know that it happens all the time, okay? So we need to learn from other countries, especially the Chinese system, which I think is a system, despite whatever other criticism we may have China's governance system, but this particular system has genuinely provided avenues of social mobility. I mean, I often I teach children of China whose parents have really come from this background. They speak no English at all. In India, it's important for social mobility to speak English. Why? Because they have actually gone through a system whereby they've received good technical education, they've achieved certain kind of income, and their kids can then go overseas and get well educated. And whereas I think we have devalued our higher education on the one hand, but also put credentialism at such a high pedestal, and it's meant nothing in terms of social and economic mobility, and much greater frustration amongst the youth. So I really support the last question asker, the purpose of the last question, that we really need an good technical education system which does not devalue the idea of getting a technical degree.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for the question, Dr. Ranjanduda. That was really helpful. Some of the questions that we're getting from the audience is around the precarity that is driven by AI, right? So how is AI shaping the idea of democracy, the influence of social media on the idea of democratic participation? Another aspect of this is also fake news, post-truth, right? What does engagement really look like when the youth doesn't know what you go to as your source of truth? Hearing from you on this will be super helpful.
I suppose every generation has felt that when the printing press was invented, and the Bible was printed at large scale, right? And the church people said, like, this is the end of civilization. Everyone would not read the Bible, because increasingly the Bible printing moved from being printed in Latin to printed in local languages, English, for example. So every generation has experienced a sense of anxiety about technology, just as we currently are experiencing a sense of anxiety about AI. But I think AI is a different kind of technology to other forms of technology. I know because I teach at university, and now increasingly it's difficult to work out. We are always now marking essays under suspicion because we have no idea as to has AI been used or not. But I think it is important, particularly in the context of precarity, because AI will get rid of lots of jobs, to nevertheless ensure that people do not only go through, to coin a phrase, an AI university. People need to still go through a solid kind of education which is not entirely dependent on AI. Because ultimately, what will inform AI is not AI. What will inform our capacity to deal with AI is an education of a much more traditional kind. Technology does not, technology is always driven by the social context in which it exists. So those of us and those people who had a good, solid traditional education will be able to take advantage of AI than those of us who think that's okay to just to learn about AI or get a degree in AI. When the IT revolution comes about, large numbers of people start doing, data entry operators, and they remain at that level. They become what once upon a time people who only learned typing were able to. They remain typists. So, but those when the the IT industry took off, those who decided to undertake not just data entry level kinds of training, but other kinds of training. They're the ones who moved on to other jobs, social mobility, economic mobility, et cetera, et cetera. And that is also important in terms of AI. We must ensure that you don't give people only data entry kind of AI training. And that means people continuing to take part in traditional, solid, well-formulated degrees, whether these are technical degrees or university degrees. So rather than failing AI, what we need to understand is that we do not, we must avoid people getting only solely trained in AI. Because that itself is a recipe for disaster, because AI keeps changing. You need the capacity to think about AI, and that capacity can only come from other fields. And that's really important. Whether it's, even to think about what is fake news requires that we have critical thinking. Critical thinking comes not from AI. Critical thinking comes from other fields of inquiry, other fields of education.
No, 100%. And I think there's a lot of interesting dialogue happening around cognitive dissonance. What does it really mean to be holding on to what are human traits, right, in an AI-driven world, and the pressure of productivity and efficiency that the youth is experiencing in the workforce? I think those things definitely, they definitely will hopefully get regulated over a longer period of time when people recognize the importance of human in the loop, really. So something that you had mentioned was along the lines of fragmentation of youth. And we've always had that across, or at least it's been studied a lot across the dimension of class, caste, gender, right? But there are also new dimensions. For example, you mentioned access to technology. That becomes a dimension of fragmentation. It would be interesting to hear from you on how these new dimensions of fragmentation are shaping youth identity and a sense of self. For example, a lot of social capital could now be considered as how many likes, shares, and views you're getting on social media, right? Like that is a way to think about gaining social capital. Hearing from you on this idea of fragmentation through technology will be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we've always had fragmentation. Of course, there's never been a monolithic youth category. We've always had that fragmented. In some kind of ironic ways, of course, technology has also promoted a certain sense of empowerment. Okay? That's what I forgot. Technology doesn't do only one thing. It can disempower people, it can also empower people. So, there is greater capacity for people to earn an income through becoming YouTubers. And that requires a familiarity with cinema techniques, which at once upon a time would also only have been available to certain kinds of people. Now everyone is a filmmaker, right? So in some ways, of course, technology, it doesn't invent fragmentation. It builds upon that fragmentation. So it can both use that technology negatively, but also positively. So I'm not really a technophobe as such, right? I may not know much about technology, but I'm not really a technophobe. So I mean, technology can only build upon what exists. It does not invent anything. Okay, it always operates on the fractures and fragmentations, homogeneities, or lack of homogeneity that exists. What is important is to think about fragmentation in terms of asymmetries, and what is crucial that if people are to genuinely take advantage of what technology can provide, is to think of the social asymmetries through which they may not be able to take advantage. And that's really the crucial thing. So many of the people who are part of CJP, for example, may well be people who are not in a position to take the best advantage of technology. So I think the role of the state continues to be to try and create as much of a level playing ground in the face of market-driven forces, in the face of new technologies, and in the face of unequal access to all these. So, and I think that's where fragmentation in terms of caste and class and what the role of state should be. The state should not itself become. I think I continue to think the state has a really important role. I don't think the state should go away, and the market should do everything. In fact, I think the state should seriously think about what it cannot do. I don't think state should run airlines, for example. Like many other people on the left, I don't think it should run. There's something the state should do, like health, education, it should not do certain kind of things. In order to genuinely address the fragmentation that exists in society, the asymmetries that exist in society. So here I'm trying to think about how to think about the asymmetries that exist, what is the role of the state, and what's the role of the market.
No, definitely. And I think that's a good segue to what Dr. Ranjan Duda is asking. He's asked a broad question, but hearing from you to ground it in something more specific will be helpful. Do we need laws to censor social media, right? And what is the movement happening, or what is the discourse around that, and how is that playing out in India?
So do we need laws
to censor social media? Yes.
To regulate social media?
Censorship. Yeah.
It's interesting because Australia has introduced laws about social media. People in a certain age group. Yeah. The UK wants to introduce it. I'm kind of torn. I mean, people often come across, like earlier there used to be an idea that violence in cinema produces more violent society. There's actually no proof of that. There's no proof that more violent. In fact, Hindi cinema historically may not have had physical violence, but also forms of symbolic violence. Right? That I think is much more significant. So it's a difficult question to answer. Sometimes I think that, yes, I think you need certain kinds of laws in terms of hate speech, for example, hate speech. There should be certain kinds of laws about what can be said in social media. But once you introduce laws, and here, while earlier I spoke in favor of the state is a strange beast, right? Once you introduce certain kinds of laws that restrict the state, irrespective of what political party in the power, will never get rid of these laws. So what is what's the line between? It's something that needs to be said. Certain kinds of things I need laws, I think, and certain kinds of things that we need to not treat the general public as children, right? We should not infantilize the public. So I would say that certain kinds of social media activity do need laws, certainly on hate speech, for example. And I think certain kinds of social media activities should be left open in terms of public debate about what's happening. So I don't think we need a state that is, in effect, a nanny state, right? And that's why we need a discussion about what kinds of things need regulation of social media, that rather than saying that everything in social media needs regulation. Certain things do. Again, it's something that I don't have a definitive answer, but I would say it certainly needs an open discussion.
Yeah. Sir Madhu, Professor Shwata Madhu, sir, has a question on CJP, and I think this has been a recurring theme in our discussion, right? And really trying to deconstruct what this moment in time is. Shouldn't the ruling party have distanced itself from the pejorative term like cockroach for unemployed youth, especially given that 40% of graduates are unemployed and have been for several years? What have they really missed there? What has the ruling party missed there in their approach towards youth engagement?
I think because of the fact that the ruling party has experienced or has had the capacity to so unilaterally crush dissent, I thought they would do it this time. They thought they would do it this time, right? Almost no form of dissent has been allowed. Okay. Number one, they also thought that by and large, youth in India is largely indifferent to anything except what it promotes as ideology. So in that sense, I think it has misjudged what people feel. But on the other hand, of course, CJP at these various venues, I don't think it's drawn hundreds of thousands of people. Maybe it's like we have something like 65% of the Indian population is under 35, 50% is under 25. But I don't think it has drawn anything in numbers in terms of the population we have of young people. So in some ways, I think the ruling party can still rest comfortably in the idea that these protests really are only drawing hundreds of people. Even the India Against Corruption movement drew a much larger number of people. Okay, so I'm kind of unsure about how threatened the ruling party feels. Even now, there are talks that the BJP minister who's been asked to resign may or may not. I mean, we don't know that, right? There's no So I am not so convinced that the ruling party actually feels threatened. I actually think that India is a post-ideological society. I don't think we have any specific ideologies. We don't have any consistent ideologies. Even if we did, we moved on. We had consistent ideology at the time of the nationalist movement, 1947, around then, anti-colonial movement, and we had this relatively consistent ideology in the anti-emergency movement. Since the 1990s, I think we've become largely a post-ideological society. We are able to exist alongside multiple ideologies. So, and I think ruling party is well aware of that there is no consistency in how young people think because there's no consistent youth population and there cannot be in a country like India. So at one point, I think it did misread what young people think about ideas of being called cockroaches. But subsequently, I think that it has enough, if wisdom is the right word, nous is the right, if enough knowledge to realize that that there may not be a consistent attitude across the board about being called a pejorative name. That and you know that there's no consistent politics around it. So I think it's both a misjudgment, but also a subsequent idea that well, yeah, you know that it may not lead to any necessary existential threat to the existing power structure in India.
Yeah, yeah. I want to be mindful of time, so I know we have 5 minutes left, but you mentioned an interesting word. You mentioned anger, right? An expression of anger. And I was wondering whether you're noticing any themes or patterns around the relationship between a disgruntled youth and the kind of crime that we're noticing in urban centers. Are you seeing anything there that's worth thinking about through a lens of youth?
The kinds of, sorry, crime?
Crime, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's been two things that happened, right? One of the most significant things that has happened in India over the last maybe 2 to 3 decades is a complete change in the patterns of habitation. About 300 cities across India are building gated communities or have built gated communities. Now, that is a reflection of two things. One is a loss in the capacity, in people's loss in belief by large numbers of people the state can prevent what they see as crime. But in actual fact, on the ground, no necessary increase in crime. So in all these around the gated community, there has not really been an increase in crime if you look at crime statistics across the country. So, I mean, what has happened is a notion of crime which does not actually match reality. So I think a lot of the anger, I mean, I'm surprised that the youth anger, in fact, does not translate into much greater crime. And that is what is remarkable about India. So that in fact, they're not greater crime, given the fact that over the last decade and a half, 2 decades, youth employment is such a significant issue. People sell their family lands and get degrees, but don't get jobs. People are going overseas and they've, family have invested crores to get degrees, and they come back and they find that there are no jobs for them. So I don't think there's necessarily a great link between, there is a great deal of anger, but not necessarily, I think, that there's any great significant rise in youth crime. I'm surprised there's not greater youth crime. And I think that translates, because people are not able to give vent to what's happening to them, that in fact translates into greater anger. In fact, what it leads to is not so much crime, but much more harmful activities, a much greater rate of youth suicide, for example. So self kind of inflicted crime rather than crime upon others. I think that is what we should be, that what we should be much more concerned about, and something that's really quite significant. If you look across the board in India, youth suicide is something that is dramatically something that we should be concerned about. And it's linked to frustration about jobs. It's linked to frustration about lack of capacity to fulfill one's aspirations.
It's also interesting because maybe what the lived real experience of an individual is very different from what you're seeing in terms of the discourse that the state is propagating, right? In a lot of ways, that it isn't actually that bad a situation, but your lived experience is what the problem is, which could lead to self-harm and things like that. No, so that's absolutely very interesting. We have 2 minutes left with you, so I definitely want to take those 2 minutes to thank you so much. This has been extremely, extremely interesting. I'm sure for not just me, but the entire group of audience that's joined us. Anekdhara does this very often, and this is the intent, right, to talk about things that matter with people who know what they're talking about. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Sir, any closing words from Madhu?
Yeah, I just apart from thanking Professor Srivastav and Professor Vaid and you, Akanksha, it was very nice and a very well covered webinar. Apart from thanking my entire team, I just want to announce to the participants, first of all, also thank you to all the participants who were here on the YouTube with us. Our next webinar is on 26th July, and it is on a theme called Alternative Futures, and it will feature Ashish Kothari and KJ Joy. They've been doing some work on the ground. They will present what possible things can happen to an India that is unshackled through these alternative futures. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Anekdhara team. Thank you. Thank you.
So live ended.
Okay, thank you.
Nice, sir.
Nice, sir.
Mm.
Thank you.